How far would you go to protect the reputation of your family? Would you spend your entire life savings? Would you somehow take on the entire federal government, the Justice Department, the FBI, and everybody else they throw at you? The Varsity Blues recruiting scandal was one of the biggest scandals of the past quarter century.
College admission scandal that rocked this nation.
You know the details. Lori Loughlin, Felicity Huffman, wealthy parents around the country who got their kids into prestigious universities.
Operation Varsity Blue.
It made headlines, but today you're going to find the scandal is the scandal within the scandal. Welcome, everybody. I'm Tom Zenner. Tom Zenner Scandal, co-host of One Degree of Scandalous with the one and only Kato Kaelin.
So good to be here. What a show we have. Oh, it's going to be amazing.
I think I downplayed it a little bit. Kato, you know the story. The Varsity Blues, it dominated media headlines in 2019 when this thing broke, and it ruined lives. And folks, we have the real story today.
And the thing about it is that it's such a gripping story because of the celebrity involvement. And we're in L.A., and we hear Lori Loughlin, who's married to Massimo, the fashion designer.
The designer for
then
Target.
You've got Felicity Huffman, married to William H. Macy, Fargo, and the other show on Showtime that I don't watch. But it's got all the elements, and you are...
Yeah.
And I know you're really directly involved with this. Not financial, well, kind of financial, but you were the one that set this today up with our guest. And Tom sent me, I didn't know we were having a show today, and it was like on real quick, Kato, can you do it? Yes, watch this. I became an instant fan of John Wilson from this. And I'll tell you why. It's because you believe when something's true. It's sort of a master class on believing in yourself. You know something's not true, and you're going to fight it no matter what. You're going to defend your family. And that's what he did. And this is a feature film, the Academy Award winning thing, and maybe who knows what'll happen.
Well, a lot of people saw the documentary, the kind of part acting, part documentary on Netflix. Huge numbers, huge viewers. The media coverage was astronomical. Just the backstory here, Kato. I'm a writer. I'm a ghostwriter. I work for an agency where there's opportunities to write these books. They'll tell you what it's about, and then you try to pitch yourself. As soon as I knew this book was available, that one of the parents in the Varsity Blues scandal was going to write a book, I was going to do whatever it took to get it, right? It wasn't easy. I was even going to bypass the agency and just try to reach out to this parent on my own and say, screw the agency. But I was selected to write this book. So one of the parents in the Varsity Blues scandal, the guy who the whole scandal was built on. And folks, the whole thing was a sham. A big part of it, you're not going to believe the details of the scandal within the scandal. So John and I collaborated on this book for the better part of a year. A lot of work. We dug deep into this thing. So I know all about it, and I know the family very, very well. And now it's time for America to meet the family and find out just what happened to them.
Right.
And why it was so egregious and why it was just so... you won't believe the details, and we're going to get into them. Are you ready?
I am. I remember you calling me from Cape Cod many times going, Kato, you won't believe this. I'm in a 4,500 square foot guest house. And I said, Tom, quit rubbing that in my face.
Hey,
my goodness.
The Kennedy compound is involved in this story.
There's
so
Taylor
much.
Swift, everybody's
Taylor
in this
Swift.
thing.
Okay, so let's bring him in from Cape Cod. John Wilson. John, welcome. I'm glad you had the first time to meet Kato. You and I don't know each other very well, but it's great to see you. Thanks for taking the time. I've been trying to get you on the show for a while, so thank you.
Absolutely. It's great to be here.
All right. So I think what we do is we start at the beginning of the story. And John is an extremely successful businessman, consultant. He was the president of Staples Global. He was the president of The Gap, ran a very, very, very successful consultancy business, built a great life for himself and his family. Now, his backstory is phenomenal too, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But John, let's start with the scandal. 2019. I remember where I was when I heard the first news reports. I was in Manhattan Beach, just driving on Highland Avenue. I heard the news, and I'm going, holy crap, I think this thing's got legs. You could tell it's one of those stories that the media would be all over. So, John, when your life changed, where were you?
Well, the incident change for me was literally flying in from an international trip with one of my clients from Europe to Texas to the Houston airport. And coming through immigration, my passport got flagged. I was asked to go into the back room. I went into the back room, and then immediately two FBI agents had me stand against the wall, handcuffed me, and told me I was under arrest for honest services fraud. And you have to understand it from a personal perspective. I've never been arrested in my life. I've never been charged in my life. I've never been in a courtroom in my life, not even for a tour. And so to be arrested at the airport was just shocking. And when they said it was for honest services fraud, I just didn't understand what that was. And I asked the two agents, what is that? And I was even more surprised by their answer. They said, we don't know. We've never heard of it before. And I said, how could that be? They said, it's some really unusual fraud charge. And, that's what it is. And I said, you must have the wrong John Wilson. I said, I've never committed fraud in my life. And there's 15,000 John Wilsons in the U.S., so it must be some other John Wilson. And they had me verify my address in Massachusetts. Oh, you're the Massachusetts guy. You're the right one. And they proceeded to then book me and then literally put me into a prison, a federal prison in Houston that same day. And that was even more shocking. So I still had no idea what I was under arrest for. I was booked. They brought me to this prison with shackles on my legs and handcuffs on my hands, like I was some kind of, vicious and violent murderer. Then they had to be stripped down, and the guards hosed me down. I felt like I was an animal. They had me hosed down in this large shower room, naked, and then they gave me a jumpsuit, and I was still talking, asking these guards, what did I do? What did I do? And they kept telling me to shut up. And I said, I don't even know what I'm here for. And they couldn't believe that. And they said, come on, and I said, really, I don't know what I'm here for. And then they realized I really was asking these questions because I had no idea. And the guy said, this is your first time ever being arrested? One of the prison guards said, yeah. He said, you better watch your back in here, son. He said, you're an old white guy. You're the only old white guy in this prison. And we're looking through this window in the guard room at the time he's about to put me in there. And there were 60 inmates in this common room in a 2-story cell block like you see in all the movies. He says, as the only old white guy, they're going to all assume you're a pedophile in here. And they're likely to try to stab you with a shiv because they hate pedophiles. I said, oh my God. I said, can't you just lock me in my prison cell? He said, no, you can't get locked in your prison cell until lockdown at night. I said, well, can I just hide in there? He said, no, if you hide in there, they're going to assume that you're a pussy and they're really going to fuck you up. He said, you got to stay in the common area and just watch your back. And so I literally, for the next day and a half, until lockdown that night, I was petrified, terrified that someone was going to stab me in the back. And it was just a horrific experience. And all the while, I still had no idea what I was even under arrest for. Crazy.
Nightmare started.
So obviously no sleep, or if you did sleep, with one eye open the entire time.
No, I didn't sleep. I was thankful. I remember when the lockdown came, there was one other guy in my cell. And so I only had one person I had to fight off if I had to. And I remember thinking to myself how lucky I was to be in lockdown at night because someone was going to try to stab me in the common area. So I was really thinking, this is so bizarre that I'm glad to be locked in a prison cell with only one guy for the night. I stayed awake all night. I was bigger than the other guy in my cell, so I told him he's taking the top bunk so I wouldn't get stabbed from underneath. I took the bottom bunk. I stayed awake all night, and I was still saying my prayers and wondering, what did I do? I had no idea what I'd even done.
Can't be a more lonely feeling in the world than that.
So, but you got a phone call? I mean, this is amazing that you're going for...
I got one phone call. I called my assistant. My wife was still in Europe, and so I called my assistant that day, and I said, look, my wife's in Europe. She's in 8 time zones difference, so it's the middle of the night for her. Please call her in the morning. Please call my brother and tell them what happened. And that was it. I got one 30-second phone call, and that was it. But my secretary had no idea what I'd done. She had no idea what was even happening. And so it wasn't until the next day, my brother flew in. He hired a lawyer in Houston. They met with me. And again, I got to come out of the prison block wearing shackles on my legs and handcuffs on my hands, shuffling into this meeting room with a plexiglass, wall. And my brother told me for the first time what this was about. He said, there's something about Rick Singer and about cheating on tests and bribing people and doing fake profiles. I said, what? We didn't cheat on tests. We didn't bribe anyone. I'd gotten receipts for all my donations. And we certainly didn't cheat. My kids were very well qualified on their own. And we didn't do anything fake on our profile. So this has got to be a case of mistaken identity. And so the same thing happened when I talked to my brother.
Yep. And Cato, that was the beginning of a 4-year nightmare, really. Okay, so now he knows what the charges are. And by the way, everybody, you're not going to believe the details that are going to come out of this episode. Eventually, John would be facing more time in prison for something he didn't do than Bernie Madoff or Sam Bankman-Fried. I mean, he was facing over 150 years in prison for not only a crime he didn't commit, a crime that was made up.
Right.
I mean, and we're going to get all to that, but man, that's chilling just hearing that first part.
I was just going to say, my stomach, it's in knots hearing this of how you're treated. I'm not just saying, I'm just like, I would be so pissed off. And your attitude is just, I'm sure back then you're just going, your blood has got to be boiling. What I'm innocent. This has nothing to do with me, and you're in a federal prison.
And Cato, I'll let John. You can pick up the next part of the story because 3 days you get out of there. They wanted to hold him on $1 million cash bond. $1 million cash bond. Okay, somehow sanity prevailed. The judge that was able to say, okay, no, you can go back to Massachusetts. But John, it got worse when you got back to Massachusetts, right? Because by this time the story's out. And they're identifying these parents and who they are. So the media, this is when it got real, right? When you got home and saw all those satellite trucks and people knocking on your door. Describe what that was like.
It was horrific. As terrifying as it was being in the prison, it was much worse for my children, especially once I left Houston and flew back with my wife to Boston. And my poor daughters were only 16. My twin girls were 16 years old when this first came out. And they were being denigrated and harassed by not only media, but all the bloggers and all the media trolls. You can imagine the social media trolls. And think about how vulnerable 16-year-old girls are, right? You're already subject to enough peer pressure and enough anxiety just with the normal ins and outs of daily living. To have federal prosecutors saying you're unqualified and having the media jump on that bandwagon and to smear you through guilt by association. Here, my daughters never cheated. My daughters got a perfect score and a top 99% on their ACT. One of my daughters, when we were living in Europe, when I was working for Staples, she was being invited to European math competitions in Zurich every year. She was coming in 3rd and 4th place for all of Europe in math, right? And so getting a perfect test score and being in international competitions for math and other academics was what they were used to. And now all of a sudden they're being smeared by the media as being cheaters on these tests and being unqualified when none of that was true. And how as a 16-year-old girl do you defend yourself against these trolls in the media saying your dad cheated? Those aren't really your test scores. And how do you prove you didn't cheat, right? And so this was a devastating experience for my twin daughters. And for my son, it was even, I think, more difficult, although he was older. My son was 21 when this happened. And he had spent his entire life in sports. From a very early age, he was a very high-level athlete. And when he was 9 years old, he had a world record swimming from Alcatraz. He was the youngest person ever. He made it onto the Oprah show for that.
The Today Show covered it almost live. John, the Today Show covered Johnny's swim live, on the Today Show. He got letters from Gavin Newsom, who was the mayor of San Francisco at the time, George Bush, the president, right? And the funny part was Katie Couric was trying to hook up her daughter with Johnny. I mean, it was a big story. It was on all the network news.
And it's a famous swim, Alcatraz
9 years
Island,
old.
back to the shore. It's a very famous swim.
Yeah, my son was an athlete from an early age. He had competed for 10 years in swimming year-round and then water polo. When he was about 12 years old, he's got into water polo as well. He played on top national teams. He was on the Stanford Club team for 6 years. His Menlo School team was coached by one of the leading coaches in the country. And so he was a national caliber. He was invited twice to join the U.S. Olympic program, the development program. So he was the real deal. He played at an extremely high level. One of his teams at Stanford Club won first place in the National Junior Olympics, and he was always a starter. So he was a real athlete who was really qualified. He joined the USC team. And his swim times proved he's one of the fastest players on that team. And the team captain even vouched for him, and a former team captain and a former player. Yep. And so he was also now denigrated as being what the government said was a false athlete or an alleged athlete. So to have something like 5,000 to 7,000 hours of training just thrown out the window by the federal government saying, you weren't really an athlete, you were a false athlete, you were an alleged athlete, was devastating, right? His close friends knew the truth, but the rest of the world thought he was a false athlete.
And just imagine the social media running with this thing. And that's what the kids are seeing constantly. And Johnny's still at USC when this is all going down. I'm going to let you ask the next question, but let me bring some context to everybody with this scandal. Remember, it was some of these parents did do things, right? It all centered around the consultant that John just mentioned, Rick Singer. Okay, that was the mastermind behind this. Now, he had a legitimate side of his business, like probably over 80% it was legit. They would consult with kids, help them prepare for the ACTs, open some doors on the recruiting end. But then he figured out later that there's this side door entrance, right? And by the way, some of his legal clients were Steve Jobs, Joe Montana, Wall Street parents, Silicon Valley. So there was a legitimate side to his business and then that dark side. And it all centered around some of these parents doing shady things, doctoring photos, cheating on tests, having test takers take their test to allow them to get into Brown, Yale, Georgetown, some prestigious schools around the country. So if you don't fully know what the scandal is, that's kind of the basis of it.
So with the other people, if we can mention, like Felicity Huffman's child with Macy and Lori Loughlin, so their kids were not athletes, but saying they would be athletes, or that, and where John's kids are actual athletes that was thrown out, and perfect ACT scores.
Yeah.
So the other ones were not telling the truth.
Yeah.
Where John is the one that it's the man of truth right here.
And you got lumped into that, John, right? Because you saw what the other parents were doing.
Right. We had no idea the other parents. We knew Singer had 2,000 clients or so. He came highly recommended to us by a contact at Goldman Sachs, who had been an advisor to us for a decade before we met Singer. So he came highly recommended. We knew he had lots of clients. It turned out he had over 1,700 clients, at least in the records that we saw. And they only charged 30 parents or 33 parents. And so they charged fewer than 2% of his clients. So 98% of his clients were never charged. I assume most of them were innocent like we were. And so we asked ourselves again and again, what did we do to make that cut? Because they had overwhelming evidence that our kids were qualified on their own merits, that we didn't cheat, we didn't bribe anyone. I got receipts for my donations from USC, and yet they charged me anyway. As we got into it and dug further, and later on as well, we've talked to some former FBI agents and some former prosecutors from the Boston office, and they all confirmed that they used me for a venue hook, they called it, they used me to justify bringing all the trials from California and other places in the country to Boston. So the Boston-based prosecutors needed one person in Massachusetts, if they called this a giant conspiracy, to allow them to bring all of the trials and, of course, all the media spotlights to Boston. And so I was that one person. And whether I was innocent or not didn't really matter because I was the only Singer client in Massachusetts. So they had to get me because if they didn't, the trials would have all been held in California and somebody else would have gotten the media attention, not the Boston prosecutors.
And the prosecutors only did it because they pretty much knew you're an innocent guy, but they're doing it because they're poisoned. They want to be these media stars, correct?
Yeah, they knew there'd be media attention for this high-profile case. Once you get some Hollywood celebrities involved and some other rich and wealthy parents, they knew this case would have a lot of media legs. I'm sure they did research on that. And so they did whatever they could. They called them venue wars and venue battles to win the battles to keep the case and the trials here in Boston. And so that's what they needed. They needed me to keep the case here in Boston.
Here, so I'll share this with you too. So just to paraphrase what he said.
Yeah.
So most of the parents that were arrested were on the West Coast. That's where Singer was. His business was primarily on the West Coast. But this shows you how devious these federal prosecutors can be. So the lead prosecutor in Boston saw the opportunity. They found one of his clients did not give a damn if he did anything or not. So then, like John said, they could lump all these cases, Cato, not individual cases, into a conspiracy. Then under federal charges, then you can lump them into one case and they're all tried in the same courtroom, same city. So everybody in California, Lori Loughlin, Felicity Huffman, all those parents had to fly back and forth to Boston,
right?
To hear their charges, to accept their plea, whatever they're doing, constantly flying back and forth. And I'll say this about the two lead prosecutors in Boston, both were gone in a year with 7-figure jobs. Okay, so you can kind of figure out their motivations from there.
Right.
But we're talking about a family that's as close-knit as anyone you'll ever meet, that support their children more than anyone probably. And I can't stress enough just how legit of an athlete Johnny Wilson is and was. He was recruited by other Division I schools. He was on Oprah. USC is the UCLA of basketball when it comes to water polo. Yeah. And he was a preferred walk-on on that team and probably would have been starting by his junior year. So anyway.
And by the way, did I speak out? Did something happen? Did I say something wrong with Lori Loughlin and Felicity Huffman? I'm not. I want to make sure.
No, they were doing it right, John. They were doctoring photos.
Yeah, there were 30 some odd parents who were charged with me, and those parents had very incriminating evidence. I saw the facts and all the different transcripts. They all had explicit statements of some sort or another, either cheating on tests or faking profiles, those kinds of things. And so they were caught with very incriminating evidence, and they all pled guilty. So I don't know what they actually did specifically, but they all pled guilty. to either cheating or bribing or putting together fake profiles. No one had a legitimate athlete like my son who actually joined the team and played on the team. My son was one of the fastest players on the USC team, and speed is an incredibly important factor in water polo for field players. So no one had anybody who went to the school. We went to the school and verified with the coach and with the development office as well. No one had a coach of their son or daughter in high school contact USC and recommend them. Our high school son's coach called USC to recommend my son to the team, and he was a nationally recognized coach. So, and my son was also the only one who had other Division I schools recruiting him. The Air Force Academy and others were recruiting my son. And the government had evidence of all of this. They knew all of this. They interviewed my son's coach. They saw the emails from the coach talking about the Air Force Academy recruiting my son. They knew my money went to USC. My money didn't go to any coach. Some other parents' money went to coaches' personal pockets or other administrators' personal pockets. My money went to USC, and USC gave me a receipt. They knew all of that. They knew my daughters had a perfect score, and they didn't cheat. They knew that. They saw the ACT test results, the perfect score and the 99th percentile score. So they knew all of that. They knew my son was, from the USC standards, he had a 3.8 GPA, and he had a 93 percentile. He was in the top quartile at USC for athletes. So they knew all of these facts, and yet they disregarded that, and they had to charge me. So they falsely charged me to really create the venue opportunity to bring all the trials to Boston.
And your daughters at that time are 16. Your son, Johnny, is 21. That is probably the ripe age for all social media. Your advice was do not get on any social media, because I imagine how at age 16, they can be, anybody could be so cruel. Was that their advice, or did they just get off it on their own, because they were probably being attacked every day?
We certainly advised them to not use social media, but I'm sure they kept looking at it from time to time, or their friends would share, look what they're saying about you now. You know, so it's difficult to put a complete cone of silence around teenage girls, but we did our best to try to insulate them. But we had reporters even coming to the house when we weren't there sometimes. My wife and I would be at meetings. Reporters would come to the house and knock on the door and try to get my daughters to come and interview them. You know, people were doing horrific things. One of the reporters went to my brother who lived in Tennessee, and they went to his ex-wife. He had been divorced, and saying they want to get some dirt on John Wilson. She said, no, we don't have any dirt on him. He's a nice father. So the reporters would stop at nothing to try to get some dirt here, and they literally were trying to talk to my children directly, minors. They were talking to my brother's ex-wife, and they were just doing anything they could to smear us through guilt by association. And that was the effective strategy that the government used. When there's 50 people charged, and all 49 of them plead guilty because they did bad things, people think that I must be guilty too. The government never said that there's, by the way, 1,700 innocent other clients for Singer. Everybody presumed that the only people who charged were guilty, and Singer only worked with guilty people. The government never said, hey, put this in perspective. Singer had 1,700 wholesome accounts, and he had, 2% were guilty. And they just smeared us through that guilt by association.
Yeah. So, Cato, basically the Wilson family's collateral damage. The government knew they didn't do anything. But, I mean, if one innocent family has to take a fall for their greater good, they don't care. Okay, so it's not like there was any gray area. Well, was he guilty? Was it? He wasn't, and they knew it. So everybody gets hit with that one felony charge that John mentioned, honest services fraud, which nobody really knew what it was. And then all the other parents take their pleas, right? Mm-hmm. But John, this started a cycle for you, because in order for this to work, they had to get you. You had to take a plea. They had to. This couldn't work really without the venue hook in Boston, going down with everybody else. So you decided to fight, and I think it's important to describe how your family drew a line in the sand, because you could have taken a plea and said, admitted to something you didn't do, but maybe eventually get on with your life, because by now all your income streams had been shut off. No one wanted to touch you. You were radioactive. How did that go in your family? You had the option. Okay, well, we'll plead guilty and hopefully put this behind us, or we're fighting. We'll put everything on the line. All our chips are on the table. Right. It could cost us tens of millions of dollars. How did you rationalize and justify that in your mind that it was worth it?
It was probably one of the most important decisions I've ever had to make in my life, and one that I hope no one else ever has to face, because it is devastating to be innocent and falsely accused the way we were. And it was doubly devastating because it wasn't just accusing me, but the collateral damage was my children were unqualified, and that's why I did this. And so it accused my children of being unqualified at the same time. And that was probably the biggest factor for my wife and I. So we agonized over this decision for quite some time. The lawyers warned us up front. We had hired some very good lawyers, and they warned us up front that fighting the federal government is almost impossible. They win 98, 99% of the time, right? And they can tilt the playing field to their advantage at every step in the process, and they did. And they have unlimited resources, and they do. And they'll do everything they can in the media to smear you while you're being gagged by the judge and the courts from saying anything. And so they'll spin public opinion against you. And it'll be like living in the emergency room for 2 or 3 years and that kind of pain. That's what they warned us, right? Or you can take a plea. You can save them millions and millions of dollars it'll cost you to fight them. You're only going to have a 2% chance of winning anyway. You'll get less time in prison. But you'll have to confess to a crime, confess to a felony. And for us, I could have lived through that, even though personally I have a hard time confessing something I didn't do. But for me, the biggest factor, there were 3 things in this that really led us to fight and draw that line in the sand, was if I confessed, it would reinforce the false narrative that my kids weren't qualified. That the reason I did this, the reason I had to bribe allegedly, was because my kids weren't qualified. They had to cheat on their tests. They had to cheat on their athletic profiles and so forth. And therefore, I was bribing to cover up their inadequacies. And nothing could be further from the truth. My kids were all highly qualified. So that was the number one reason why we decided to fight, because I could not damn my children to live forever with that stigma of their own parents didn't believe in their qualifications. So that was reason number 1. Reason number 2 was really I, as a person, couldn't live with myself publicly confessing to a crime I didn't commit. I didn't commit any crimes here. I followed all the rules that USC laid out for us, and I donated through legitimate charities that were IRS certified, and we never gave any false information to anyone. And we'll talk later on about I even passed polygraph tests with the head of the FBI and the head of the CIA to prove that. But I didn't do anything wrong was reason number 2, and I wasn't about to confess publicly to a crime I did not commit. And the third reason really is what the government did to me was just plain wrong, and what they did to me should never happen to anyone. And I'm a fighter. And I've grown up in tough circumstances, had to fight my way for everything I've earned in my life. And I would like to fight to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else as well, because it's just plain wrong how they abuse me and abuse the system for their own careers.
Okay. So once you establish that you're fighting, you got to be all in. And, these are big checks you have to write to attorneys. And the problem is, Cato, is the government, like John said, has unlimited resources. They'll do whatever it takes to make him go down. So that means more felonies, more bullshit felonies. This, they threw them at you. John, talk about what they did when they realized that you weren't caving, and then they had to get extreme to try to get you to that ultimate, in their mind, victory for them where you would take a plea. So how bad did it get as far as the felony charges?
It was horrific. Literally, over the course of the first year, they piled on 5 additional sets of charges, not for new activity, but all related to the same crime, allegedly, of donating to a school and getting a boost in the admissions process, right? That was the crime, and having some false statistics in my son's resume. It turned out that they changed my son's swim time by 8%, and that was the crime here that was alleged. So what they did is they kept charging me with more and more crimes. Every 2 or 3 months, they would add on more charges, more felony charges. So it went from honest services fraud to bribery to federal programs bribery to conspiracy to commit fraud to wire services, wire fraud to tax fraud. All of these charges, right? They kept but they didn't do it all at once. They literally did it every 2 months, and they'd say, "Look, if you don't confess now, then we're going to add on more charges in a few months." And we'd say no. And then a few months would come and they would add on more charges. And of course, that rings up the legal bills as well and drags this whole process out. And I'd say, no, again, I'm not going to confess. And they say, we'll add on even more charges. And they did that 5 times, right? All for the same activities. There was nothing new they uncovered. It was all the same thing. And it was just devastating because now, as it racked up, they had 9 felonies and 180 years of prison time. They said, you can go to prison for 180 years if you don't confess. And in the end, I told my lawyers, I said, look, you can charge me with trying to assassinate Kennedy and saying I was in the grassy knoll. I'm not going to confess. I didn't do this. So I told them to go pound sand, and then they finally stopped. But I was facing 180 years of prison time. This is not something you take lightly at my age. 180 years of prison time for making a donation to these colleges for kids who are highly qualified because I got a tiebreaker boost, and Singer changed my son's swim time by 8%. I said, this is crazy.
It's like going through an intersection as it's turning green to yellow and getting pulled over by the SWAT team, right? Getting a ticket and then getting manslaughter charges, hit and run, bribery. Right. You know, it's like, it's so over the top. You can't make this up, yet they lived it.
Yeah. I'm just, the more you hear it, just,
okay.
Just the corruption is just driving me crazy right now. And to know John, I mean, from this, they know he's a legitimate person and they just want to ruin his life and his family's life.
And Cato, talk to us from your perspective as just a consumer of pop culture, a guy that maybe scrolled on that Netflix story, that documentary on Netflix about the Varsity Blues scandal, or what you read in the paper. What was your assumptions that, they probably did something, all these parents?
Yeah, I would, like I said before, if you hear something over and over, repetition, you just believe it. And it's sort of like, oh, John's got to be guilty. The Laughlins, everybody's got to be guilty because there's the government's behind it, and you kind of trust the government and you trust the FBI, not anymore, but you trust them and go, well, they're doing their job. They've got this guy, and everybody's got their own story. And then John, your story is all about the truth, drawing the line in the sand and saying, I might face 180 years, but I can't live this way knowing I raised my kids the right way. I raised my son did. He swam Alcatraz at 9. He's the water polo player at USC, the top school for water polo. My daughters are smart, 100% on ACT. So you're fighting for a cause. And it's a lot like, you know, it's hard to compare to anything else, but I keep thinking of that movie called Midnight
Run?
No, the one that Brad Davis from Wisconsin got locked up for drugs in Turkey. He did drugs, but he never could win. And Midnight Express, they kept piling more and more on. And he had to fight for the truth, and so
when it's hopeless too,
everything's hopeless. And John's, you're hearing from your own defense attorneys. You're hearing the government's got a 98, 99% win that you're probably going to lose, John, and you're still going, no, I'm gonna be that 1% that's going to win. So.
Did you think you could win? And and we don't have to get all the way to the end, but did you have confidence that this was going to work for you?
And when did you get that feeling of I'm going to win?
Well, no, we knew the truth, right? We knew the truth. We knew he didn't bribe anybody. We knew he didn't cheat on the test. We knew my son really played on the team, right? We said if the truth could come out, we thought we would win. We knew we would win if the truth came out. And that was the hard part because we couldn't talk to the media. We were blocked. And yet the prosecutors, every time they charged me or someone else, they got on the high horse and really used the mouthpiece of the government through the media to smear all the parents. So everybody was smeared with the same guilty brush. And we were all painted with that dirty brush. And so my kids all of a sudden became cheaters in the eyes of the media, unqualified, and fakes and frauds, and that I bribed coaches. Even though there were no facts to support that, that was just the assumption because people assumed that the government was acting with good motives. And I still believe in government. I still believe that most people in the FBI and in the prosecutor's offices do the right thing. But in any large organization that I've run or been involved with, there can be a few bad apples. And so in our case, we happen to get a few bad apples who are literally willing to say things that were not true. They said to the media, my son was an alleged athlete. For him, it's like saying he's an alleged human being. What do you mean alleged athlete? He had a world record. They knew that. He was being asked to join the U.S. Olympic Development Program 2 years in a row. He played at the national level year after year after year. And they knew all of that, and they still called him an alleged athlete to fit their narrative with the media. So he got, basically lumped in with kids who are sitting on rowing machines doing fake pictures of being in a crew team.
Yeah. And the other thing to understand too is the timing for this was just perfect in America because everybody wanted to believe these were just white privileged people working the system, getting their kids, denying other people the opportunities to get into these universities. And when everybody takes the plea deal, and they're admitting to doing it, everybody gets lumped in there. Now, so all these parents were looked at as greedy and selfish and blah, 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 blah. And a lot of their actions were. Nobody knows John Wilson's background except a few people. It's the furthest thing from privilege. And John, Cato, wait till you hear how John grew up, because I think this is a really important part of the story. It's where you got a lot of your fighting spirit. You became an independent person that took on the world. But when you understand the poverty and the adverse circumstances that John grew up in, it's going to make your head spin. So John, if you can, Walk us through it, because it's truly unbelievable, what you were brought up in and where you ended up.
Sure. Before we do, let me just give one other background thing of that, and that is that what some of the other parents did to basically cheat and bribe to get unqualified kids into the process is definitely wrong, grossly unfair, and I can understand the wrath of most of the world when they hear that, because if my more qualified son or daughter is getting bumped by an unqualified kid who's bribing or doing something to cheat on the tests, that would outrage me as well. That was not our situation at all. Our kids were more than qualified. I made sure that their statistics were always in the top quartile for the schools they applied to. So my kids were never going to have to bump anyone, even if we made a donation and got some preferred admissions. That would not bump a more qualified kid. So yeah, I understand the anger that was out there in the world because people had unqualified children bumping more qualified kids. It's hard to be more qualified than getting a perfect test score. So when we made that donation, they said your donation will help fund scholarships for other kids. That's great. Just like I was a scholarship kid and came from a poor background, as Tom mentioned. And so I thought we were doing a good thing to help the schools fund more scholarships and fund facilities. And my kids were more than qualified. Getting those perfect test scores and so forth meant that they weren't going to be bumping a more qualified child. So I understand the anger that was out there, but our situation was very, very different. No one took the time to distinguish between my case and the other cases. They just lumped us all together.
Right.
So as Tom said, my background, really education changed my life. And that's why I'm a big believer in education. And I've literally given hundreds of thousands of dollars to educational institutions throughout my life. And in my will, I was also committed to giving millions of dollars to fund scholarships for first-generation kids. And my will was done 10 years before I even met Singer, and he knew about that. And let me tell you a bit about my background in terms of why and how I feel so strongly about education. I grew up in poverty, literally on welfare, in the projects of Hartford, Connecticut. I had a single mother who only had an 8th grade education. She had 6 children, gave 2 of them up, 1 died. She had 4 of us, we were all half siblings. So I grew up with a single mom in the housing projects of Hartford, Connecticut. And my mother had a lot of difficulties in her own childhood. So she was an abusive mother who had some severe mental health issues that created some significant emotional and physical abuse for all of us. And so my environment was not a lush or privileged background at all. My mother was half Puerto Rican, her father was from Puerto Rico, and half Polish. And so we grew up in those projects. And for the first 3 years of my life, in terms of education, first 3 years of education, I was struggling in school. We never had any insurance, so I couldn't get any glasses. I was very severely nearsighted, but I was also severely dyslexic. And so when I would go to school, I would spell things backwards in my early years. My name was N-H-O-J, John backwards. And the kids would tease me. The teachers would tease me. And they would slap me. Back then, you could slap kids. The teachers would slap me in the back of my head all the time. Mrs. Gary saying, spell your name the right way. And I said, I am. He said, you're not. And the kids would call me Nodge. So I would like to skip school. I hated school. I skipped school a lot, but my mother was fairly abusive. And so I didn't want to go home to my mother either. And so we lived in the projects, and there were some railroad tracks near us. And there was a hobo encampment near us. And I know hobo may not be a popular term these days, but these men called themselves hobos. They were proud to be hobos. They said that hobos worked and the bums didn't. And they would travel the rails and work, and they would spend their summers and fall and spring in Hartford working on farms and doing construction. And I would go to the hobo camp, and at first they kicked me out, but one gentleman, Big Sam, he let me in. He said, you can stay, but you have to get firewood for the camp for the day. So my job became, I was only 7 years old, getting firewood for the hobo camp. And I wanted to be a hobo when I grew up. I remember my very first thing, I wanted to be a hobo. And I admired these guys. They were mostly World War II veterans. And I got firewood. And I had to go further and further as the years went on to get firewood further and further away, dive into dumpsters, trash cans, getting broken furniture, whatever I could get for the hobo camp, to stay away from school and to stay away from my mother. I learned a lot of life lessons from those hobos. And Big Sam taught me a lot about life, taught me about work ethic. I couldn't sit at the camp by the campfire unless I got enough firewood for the whole day. That was job one at 7 years old, right? He taught me many other life lessons as well. So my upbringing was very, very different than many people would assume as part of Varsity Blues. But I'll tell you that, as time went on, we were adopted. My mother got married several times, but she married to a sergeant in the Air Force named Tom Wilson. He adopted us, changed my name to Wilson. He moved us to a very modest community in northern Connecticut, a little 900-foot house, but it was a luxury palace compared to the projects. And then I got eyeglasses for the first time. And I could actually see, and I got help. And I started becoming very successful at school. And I ultimately became the valedictorian of my high school. And I was working jobs all the time. When I was 12 years old, I worked for 4 years picking tobacco to help my family make ends meet. I was making a little more than $1 an hour picking tobacco. And those are long, hot, sweaty jobs, dirty jobs. Picking tobacco in the fields all day in the hot sun, 8 hours a day plus 2 hours on the bus, the tobacco bus, back and forth from our projects in the neighborhood to the fields. So those are long days, and I didn't mind working hard, but that's the kind of life I had. And when I went to college, I got a scholarship to go to a school called RPI in upstate New York for engineering. I was good at math and good at science. I couldn't do much with reading and writing because of my dyslexia, but I was pretty good at equations and math and science. I went to an engineering school, and I'll never forget that, literally my first year, I was 17 years old when I went to RPI. I was 18 by the time I finished my freshman year. I did very well at school. I had a 3.8 or a 4.0, and I got a job offer from Exxon for a co-op job. And I'll never forget that co-op job. It was just a summer job, but it was treating me like a real engineer. I was getting $1,960 a month was my job offer. Just a year and a half before, I was making $1 an hour sweating in the tobacco fields. And all of a sudden, with 1 year of college, I was making, $1,960 a month. This is back in 1978. That was real money. That was about $100,000 a year in today's money. I remember getting that letter, that offer letter, and I went to my father, my stepfather. My stepfather was a very disciplined man. He was an Air Force sergeant. He was also Air National Guard. He worked 3 jobs, in part to keep away from my mother, but in part to make money, because an Air Force sergeant didn't pay a lot of money in the 70s. So he worked all day in the Air Force. He worked evenings at a restaurant called Friendly's. He was a manager of the restaurant. And at nights, he worked the graveyard shift. And when I showed him my letter, my dad, I've never seen him show any emotion in his entire life, even to this day. He's still alive, my stepdad. He's 94. And the only time I ever saw him start to cry was when he read my letter. And he saw my letter, and he broke into tears, a bit of tears. And he said, "This is more money than I'm making with all 3 of my jobs combined." And I knew it was a good number. I said, "This is great." But I didn't know it was more than he made with all of his jobs combined. He said, "Oh, my God." I said, "I'm going to quit school now." I said to him, "I've got to quit school right now because I'm never going to do any better than this. I don't need to spend any more money on school," because I was paying for school partially myself, partially with scholarships. I said, "I'll quit school now. I'll work here, and this will be fantastic." And then automatically the drill sergeant, my dad, just snapped up, and he almost, beat me. He said, "No, you can't quit school. You'll never get that job unless you finish your degree. But remember this, and remember this for the rest of your life, the power of education. I have a high school education. Your mother has an 8th grade education, and you're making with 1 year of college more than we make with all of our jobs combined. Don't ever forget that." He said he wished he could do more to help me with school, but he couldn't. We didn't have the money. But to do whatever I could to help my kids go to school and finish their college as well. And so it was an important life lesson, one of those aha moments for me. But that was a very profound, transition, going from literally a year and a half before, when I was 15 or 16, picking tobacco, sweating in those dirty, harsh fields for $1 an hour, to literally making almost $2,000 a month with 1 degree of college. So it was a very profound experience. And so education for me has always been important. And it carries forward to even 10, 20 years later. 20 years later, literally in 1998, 20 years later to the year, I was doing well enough at business that I created scholarships for all of my nieces and nephews to pay for all their college. I put $100,000 back in 1998, when that was real money, into scholarships for all my nieces and nephews to pay for all their college. I knew I was successful enough to pay for my kids' school, but that's how important school was for me. I didn't get a donation for that, a tax deduction for that, but I knew education could change lives. And so I gave, and the government had records of that as too. I gave a foundation, or not a foundation, but a scholarship fund, a trust for each of my children. My brother managed it to pay for all of their college. And back in 1998, $20,000 was enough to pay for 4 years of college. There were 5 nieces and nephews that I paid for. So that was the impact that education had on my life. Very profound. And I wanted to do whatever I could to make sure my kids and my nieces and nephews could all go to college if they wanted to do that. And so that's a bit of my backstory, not quite the story that you may have heard in the media.
You know what? If the prosecution could hear that story, you think there'd be one person going, "You know what? we got the wrong guy. This is a great human right here, and it's an amazing story.
Yeah, but
they
instead,
had that story.
Yeah, they did.
They had the story.
Yeah, and then you know what? We're going to get up to the trial here in a second because he went to trial. By now, Cato was I think 11 total felonies, facing 180 years in prison. They just kept piling him on, checks to the lawyer. I mean, imagine how expensive this is. But I'll tee this up for you, John. So Cato, John, you know, you're not going to know how the trial is going to go, but he at least wanted his friends and family and everybody to know that he had nothing to do with this, that he is an innocent man. So he got a polygraph. Now, a lot of people, you know, Google, hey, where's the nearest polygraph administrator in my town? And John did a little bit differently. And by the way, an addendum to his education talk there, he was one of the youngest graduates of Harvard Business School. So that's where he went after RPI and then the awesome corporate career. So he gets a hold of the former head of the FBI's polygraph division, Kendall Stull. We had him on our show. We love Kendall. Awesome. Instead of doing a 2-hour polygraph, he did a day and a half. I mean, there are hours and hours and hours of this. And then instead of just having Kendall tell him, hey, man, you passed, he had an independent source, the former head of the CIA polygraph division, interpret the results, right? So, John, did you think when you got that, did you think it was going to help you? Did you think, hey, take a look at this, government? And by the way, this is after the Netflix movie aired where they slandered him 26 times, you know, and so he provided that evidence to Netflix as well. But did you think that polygraph was going to get you out?
Well, we thought it would help. I really did it for two reasons, as you mentioned. First, in case something happened to me before the trial with all this stress, I was worried about getting the truth out there. And so I wanted to defend my family. And so if, God forbid, you know, I had a heart attack or anything else from all this stress, that the truth would be out there. So I wanted to verify my story with the best polygraph experts in the world. When we looked at doing a polygraph, my lawyer said, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. If you're nervous and you fail, it'll be terrible. If you pass it, it's not going to be admissible, and they're not going to believe it anyway. You're going to hire just an average Joe Blow down the street to do a polygraph. Some of these polygraph people will do anything, and they'll bend the rules. So I said, okay, I understand that, but let me look for the best in the world. I had my brother and I look for the best polygraph experts in the world. So I went to the former head of the FBI who ran all of the FBI polygraph program. And then we engaged him, and he said, look, this is so important. He said, what we can do is we can get the head of the CIA, who ran the polygraph school for the entire federal government for 10 years in South Carolina, but also ran the polygraph division for the CIA. And then he added a third person to do independent quality check, the head of the polygraph division in Washington, D.C. for the FBI, the former head. So we went to the very best in the world, and they all said that they've never seen anyone take more polygraph tests than I did in their entire careers. I did it for 2 days, full days, and then I also did another series a year later. They've never seen someone take so many polygraphs. I said, ask me any question about any topic in this case. I'm telling the truth, and I want it to be known to the world. And so we went through an exhaustive series of tests. And polygraph tests are not that easy to take. They have a series of, they hook you up to all this equipment, all this technology, from skin galvanizing technology to your chest and heart rate and your blood pressure and all these things. And so I passed all of them with flying colors. And they were surprised that I was willing to do so many. They said, look, people are normally nervous and they don't tell you your results. They can't tell you your results if you're passing or failing. I said, look, just ask me another question. Let's just get everything on the table here. And I just went again and again and again. And they've never seen anything like that. And they actually put that in a video statement as well, that they've never seen someone do as many polygraphs. So I wanted to prove that. We gave it to the Netflix people because we knew the Netflix movie was coming out. And the government also knew this. We also then gave the government access to this through a lawsuit against Netflix, a warning against Netflix. So the government had the polygraph results. And I'll tell you, in my sentencing, when they had the polygraph, when it was allowed into the sentencing hearing, they said, well, we can't use those polygraph results because they're too self-serving. All they do is help Mr. Wilson and say he's innocent. It's like, well, yeah, they're done by people who have the highest credentials in the world. And by the way, the federal government does 50,000 polygraphs a year with these same people. You know, why wouldn't you accept that as, you know, indications of my truthfulness? They said, it's just self-serving. It's like, well, yeah, it's self-serving because I'm telling the truth. You know, but that's what I said to the judge, who just said, we're not going to look at him. But, you know, it was a very frustrating experience. But at least I got it out there for the Netflix people to see, and for my family, in case anything happened to me, that at least I had the benefit of knowing I told the truth and it was verified by the world's best experts.
You know, John, when I was involved in a trial in the media, at one point they kind of put you on a pedestal and then they want to knock you down. So I had incredible amounts of negative news. But for you, someone always came out and said, no, he's a good person. While you were going through all the media coming, to your brother's ex-wife's house and all the negative news, was there one media company that said, I want to find out about the real person because they did it for me and they found out they ran a positive story? Was there anything positive? Any network come out with anything positive about you?
No, there was never a single positive case because we couldn't get our side of the story out there. So the judge prohibited us from he said, you're not going to try your case in the media. So we could never make any statements to the media. And the media just assumed we were all guilty. We were all lumped in. And the way the government put together their case against me, it was taking things out of context that made it sound like I was as guilty as the others. So, for example, other people would be talking on recorded calls about bribing coaches. Singer would be saying in the setup calls, we're going to bribe the coach, bring $60,000 in brown bag cash. We're bribing the coach. And they'd hear that again and again. In my setup call, Singer says to me, are you okay if we give a check to the coach? And I say, yeah. Well, the check we gave to the coach at USC was a check made out to the USC Athletic Foundation. So you have to give the check to somebody. So they deliberately made it ambiguous in the phone call to me. But if the media hears 30 other parents saying, we're going to bribe the coach, we're going to bribe the coach. And in my call, he says, are you okay if we give a check to the coach? And I say, yes. Oh, that must be a bribe. And so they did that again and again through these, excerpts. They took sound bites out of context and either played those or showed those in a way that made me sound guilty. So because we couldn't give the other half of the story, the media just said, everybody else is guilty. We've got very explicit statements. And if Wilson said, okay, to a check, that must mean it's a bribe. And that was the end of the story as far as the media was concerned.
It's like being in a boxing ring against Mike Tyson. You're handcuffed, right? And it's right jab, left hook, kicking the balls. Like that's the government coming at you. Nothing you can do. Those are just part of the dirty tactics that the government employed. So as this builds and builds and builds, Cato, it's going to trial. So John, take us to trial now. It's you against the federal government. You're facing 11 felonies. What were your thoughts going in? How long did it last? Give us the trial.
Yeah, the trial was, high hopes, but, modest expectations in the sense of fairness, because we knew this judge, they got to handpick this judge, which was unfair. They did something called judge shopping. And so they basically, as Tom said, were able to get the judge they wanted. All the judges are assigned randomly, that's true, but they sprinkled enough cases to get the judge they wanted. And then they amended the docket to that one judge and put all the parents into one giant conspiracy and had all 33 parents on that same judge's docket. And as soon as that happened, by the way, more than half the parents pled guilty immediately because they knew that judge was tough. The judge had a reputation for being tough and extremely pro-government. And so when that happened, half the parents pled guilty. And then over the course of the following year or so, everybody else pled guilty except, which was devastating to me. We knew that because it made me look like the worst of all the parents. So then we get into the opening statements, as we mentioned. And it was horrific having the opening statements go the way they went. And then they proceeded to make it even worse with their first witnesses was a parent, one of the other parents, who confessed and had horrific tapes. The tapes they had were talking about cheating on the test and how much it cost to get this score and that score for their kids and faking profiles. So they were explicitly involved with Singer. They were part of Singer's 30 corrupt parents that were doing bad things. Again, there were 1,700 other parents that the jury never heard about that didn't do anything wrong. But they had this one parent get on the stand, and he proceeds to say that everybody knew Singer was a fraudster. Everybody knew Singer was bribing people. We were all in on it together. It's like, wait a minute, I never even met this guy. How can you say we're all in it together? And so he went on and said that everybody knew Singer was, a fraudster. Everybody knew Singer was a con man, and on and on and on. He said that over and over again. So the jury hears this and they think, yeah, it must be true. And so that's how the case began. The very first 2 days of the case were the opening comments that talked about all these bad acts, and the very first witness who talked about all the bad things. And the tape recordings there were horrific. That this guy was caught literally agreeing to bribe, agreeing to cheat, agreeing to do all these horrific things. And then he says, everybody knew. Everybody knew Singer. And if you were smart, you knew. And they said, well, Mr. Wilson went to Harvard Business School. He was smart, so he had to know Singer was a con man. He had to know we were bribing. And so that's how the whole trial started off. And then, to believe it or not, it gets much worse during the trial. And I'll never forget the moment of truth for me was when they kept blocking my evidence. And the judge just overruled all of our evidence. He ruled against our motions 660 times. Think about that. In 3 weeks, 660 times. So he blocked things that were just totally unbelievable to my lawyers. And we didn't have novice lawyers. We had some of the best lawyers in the world. He blocked, for example, my daughter's perfect ACT score and the 99th percentile score. He blocked, so that's not admissible. hearsay. I said, what? These are business records of the ACT Corporation. My son's certified swim time with USA Swimming. He blocked. It proved he's one of the fastest swimmers and players on the USC team. Blocked. My own written will was blocked from my own trial. And on and on and on. And I'll never forget when my son's water polo coach came in to testify, and he said that my son could have been a starter by the time he was a junior or senior on the USC team, that he called the USC coaches and recommended my son, that he was incredibly fast even by USC standards. He was an A+ by USC standards for speed and for work ethic. He said, he wouldn't necessarily be a starter as a freshman because it's a national championship team. You wouldn't expect that. But by the time he was a junior or senior, he could be a starter. And when he tried to introduce my son's swim time, which would have been irrefutable proof of his qualification for the team, they blocked that and said that even though he knew the swim time, he wasn't a witness to it because it was part of the swimming team, not the water polo team, that he got that recorded swim time. And so when that moment happened, I said, we're just doomed. We're not going to get any evidence. So my daughter's perfect scores are not allowed in. My son's certified swim time not allowed in. His world record, my own will. And then I knew we were sunk because no matter what we tried, we couldn't get our evidence in. And at the end, towards the end of the trial, it got even more outrageous. We still had dozens and dozens, I think it was up to 80 more pieces of evidence to introduce. And the judge was getting so fed up. He said, how much more do you have? And they said, whatever, 60 or 80 pieces. He said, I'm just going to overrule all of your remaining evidence en masse. En masse. They said, what? You don't even know what it is. He said, it doesn't matter. I'm just overruling it en masse. We're not wasting more time on this trial. And that's what he said, I'm overruling your evidence en masse. And our lawyers were shocked at that too. I said, oh, okay. And you can't do anything. Once the judge does these kinds of things, all you can do is get defeated, get convicted, and then go to appeal. So there's no recourse.
Did you have any idea this could happen?
No,
the fix was in.
Yeah, your lawyers can ask for another judge, correct?
You can't ask for another judge.
So, John, what is the verdict?
Well, unsurprisingly, myself and the other defendant were guilty on all charges. We were just totally smeared, and the jury convicted each of us on every charge.
So when that moment happens, do you go directly to jail? Do you get to see your wife, Leslie? Do you see the kids, or is it handcuff and out?
No, fortunately, my wife and kids were there with me throughout the trial. My wife was, and my kids were there for the sentencing or for the final decision. They have a sentencing period which takes place later, and because I was a non-risk to the community, they let me out on my own recognizance until the sentencing. So the sentencing hearing would be some 2 or 3 months later. Then we were, in the meantime, filing appeal. We knew we were going to file an appeal. So we immediately began to file an appeal. The government wanted me to go to prison during the appeal process. When they saw how strong our appeal case was, they knew they were going to lose that. And so they decided to, which is very unusual, to reverse their appeal, reverse their recommendation for me to be serving time while we were waiting appeal. So there's a bond motion pending appeal. So we immediately told the media we were going to appeal because we knew we had to. We knew the trial was totally unfair. And we then filed for a motion, and we did not have to go to. I didn't have to go to prison then.
Yeah. At that moment, are you and your lawyers getting together? Are you thinking to yourself, "We're going to win. We're going to win this thing"?
Yeah. As outrageous as the trial was, we knew it was an incredibly strong appeal case. We had 17 separate grounds for appeal that were all winnable, each in of themselves. And so we had brought in some of the best appeals attorneys in the country, and they looked at our case and said, "This is outrageous. We've never seen a case this outrageous." So they said that all the egregious mistakes that were made during the trial are all reversible errors that could be then overturn the verdicts in appeal. So as painful as it was to go through the trial, the appeal process became much more positive in that sense. And so that was kind of the saving grace, the silver lining to that very dark cloud. But I still had to go through the process of getting sentenced and then waiting for the appeal hearings and the appeal process to take place, which took another year and more money.
So this would be the one time where you feel you have hope, right? Okay, because now the rules are different in appeals, okay? And when John said they had a good lawyer, I think this is the big turning point in John and Leslie for the family and for your case, John. So he interviewed a bunch of appeals attorneys, the top in the world. We're talking guys that go in front of the Supreme Court and win. And one of the biggest badasses out there is this this attorney named Noel Francisco, and he was President Trump's Solicitor General. So he was the attorney for the President of the United States. This guy is the big leagues, right? This is like Shohei Ohtani on the mound and at the plate. So and I know the story, John, and the comfort you got just when Noel agreed to take your case and how powerful he and his team were. So take us up to the appeals then. Did you think the momentum was building in your favor?
Yes, the appeal process was a totally different game because, for one, all the evidence we tried to get into the trial that was blocked, we got to share that with the appeals court. So they got to see that evidence. So even though the jury never got to see it, the appeals court got to see it. So we offered that evidence as offers of proof. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there were 17 grounds for appeal. And Noel said, this is unbelievable. It was great to have someone like Noel Francisco on our team because he was a Solicitor General. He'd managed all the Supreme Court cases for the United States, right? That's what his job was. So he knew his way around the legal system better than anyone. And he just couldn't believe how many strong grounds for appeal we had and how outrageous my trial was. And so we had to pick at least 3 or 4. We couldn't have 17. You are limited. We only had 20 pages to write an appeal. You're limited. And we had to share that with a co-defendant. So it was a very limited space. We picked the 4 strongest grounds for appeal. We won on all 4 of those grounds at the appeals court. We also had the extraordinary good fortune of having 3 different amicus briefs, which for a criminal case at the appeals level for just the circuit court never happens. It's extremely rare. So we had, for example, 2 different groups that I'll talk about. We had 11 former U.S. attorneys who were unrelated to me, unpaid, from across the country, appointed by both Republican and Democrat presidents, who wrote an amicus brief that said John Wilson did not receive a fair trial. That was unbelievable. They criticized their former colleagues, said John Wilson did not receive a fair trial. That was unbelievable. We also had a group of law professors that wrote and said, this is the first time in history that the victim of a bribe, the schools, can be the one who got the money. How can this be a bribe if USC got the money and gave a thank you note for the money, and then they claim they're a victim of a bribe? It can't be a bribe. And so those kinds of appeal briefs, support briefs, were also very powerful. But the appeal hearing itself was incredibly reassuring. When the judges were asking the governor for the first time, these judges were independent, they weren't biased, asking them hard questions about what did the Wilsons do here? What did they actually do? What evidence do you have that they did some wrongdoing here? And they kept trying to hide and obfuscate. They asked that question 3 times to the prosecutors. And they said, well, everybody did all these bad acts. I said, no, what did the Wilsons do? Well, people were cheating and bribing. No, what did the Wilsons do? And I'll never forget what they said. Well, the Wilsons, he actually edited his son's essay. And that's a crime because you're not allowed to get help on the essay. And he took photos of his son. He submitted the photos in the application of his son. They were real photos. And his son was supposed to put the photos in himself. And the judge looked at him and almost scratched and said, what? Almost every parent does that. And that was the evidence they said of my bad doing, that I edited my son's essay for his college application.
Okay. Cato, want to know what happened at appeals? Take us to the day that, the decision was made on your appeal.
So then the decision came out finally about 6 months later. They overturned all of the core convictions, but they left one conviction for the tax thing. And the tax thing was taking a donation on the wrong line of my tax return. So what had happened, Singer gave me an invoice to my company to pay for the donation to USC through his company because his foundation wasn't set up yet. My secretary deducted it on my taxes as a business expense instead of a donation expense. And that difference created a $1,400 savings in my taxes. I overpaid my taxes that year by over $100,000 because I had the wrong address. I had my California address. It didn't matter if I overpaid my taxes or not. If you put something on your tax return the wrong way, that's a felony. And so they left that conviction because I did put it on the wrong line. I did it mistakenly, but they left that felony, we think in large part to throw a bone to the prosecutors and to the judge, that the appeals court didn't want to humiliate the judge. They overturned all of the core convictions, but left that one conviction on the tax thing for $1,400.
So Noel Francisco, the right. Stud attorney, he works for a huge white-collar law firm called Jones Day. Guess where the prosecutor worked after he took his $1 million job from Boston?
He got the job at Jones Day.
Jones Day. Like I tell John all the time, that's going to be a little uncomfortable Christmas party, right? These guys work at the same law firm. It's absolutely crazy. Just as a quick update, John, we'll probably have you on again if you ever want to come on. But, he's got a lawsuit against Netflix right now because they slandered him 26 times in that show. Go watch it. They made him look bad, and they're going to pay the price, hopefully, for that. And, Cato, ask John maybe who his neighbors are.
I'm going to ask two things.
Okay, yeah.
That'll be one of the neighbors.
Yeah.
But John, I want to know with the next Netflix suit, since you got the best attorneys for your appeal, are you getting the best attorneys for your lawsuit against Netflix? I imagine you are.
Yes, we have two teams. We have a Boston team that helped us the first time around, and an LA-based lawyer as well. So we think the best of both worlds. We've got the LA expertise and some of the Boston people. We did file a suit here in Massachusetts in state court, and we won our very first significant round with them. They had a motion to dismiss, and we won that round. And that's probably the most important round in this entire process. Now we begin 2 years or a year of discovery to get into how they made the sausage in this movie, because what they did in this movie was horrific.
Well, what does the word settlement come out in dyslexia?
Now, I'm still a big believer that our government, most people in our government, by and large, try to do the right thing. And they're hardworking people that are honest. But like any I've run large organizations. Like any large organization, there can be a few bad apples. I think the temptation for a federal prosecutor can be extremely alluring. And I think that, power can corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So a prosecutor has more power than anyone in this country to literally control people's lives, their freedom, to destroy their reputations. So that power can easily be abused, and it can go to some people's heads. It doesn't mean everybody in the government is bad. I think the vast majority of people are still very good, hardworking people. But I think the power of a prosecutor, and then the absolute power, if they can pick their own judge, that compounding, there's no check and balance on that prosecutor, can really create an absolute power situation. And we know the famous saying about absolute power corrupting. And I think that's the thing we have to be guarded against as a society. It's not that every prosecutor is bad. When they're working with ulterior motives, whether they're political motives, whether they're personal career motives, and so forth, if they don't have a proper check and balance and they're allowed to do things on their own, they can go to extremes, and they can take someone like myself, an innocent family, and really harm that family in a irreversible and devastating way. And so, in part, I want to get my story out there to make sure it doesn't happen to anybody else.
Well, justice prevails.
What they did to me is wrong.
The truth prevails.
Bottom line, the truth actually prevails in your case.
Yeah, and he's had to stay silent for so long. I've been encouraging to do this podcast because I want people to see the real John Wilson, hear the real story. And I think everybody knows the scandal within the scandal now. And it's unbelievable what you thought happened, what you thought was the truth could not be further from the truth, and how they picked one family and used them as collateral damage. But thank God, a lot of prayers answered that you prevailed. And now, the tide has really turned, Cato, because it was bad news, devastating, horrible. And now it's positive. Things are rolling in the right direction. Got the Netflix suit, a couple other things out there. So, the future's bright.
Let's go out there.
No, and I've been gagged for going on 6 years now from saying anything. In fact, my probation period is not even up until this next week. And so my wife is very nervous about me even saying things that are going to upset the prosecutor. So it's a very interesting situation where you're gagged for years and years and years, and you can't get your side of the story out there. And even now, I'm still, on a bit of eggshells in terms of what we can say and what we should say to defend our family's reputation. But
I feel bad I didn't tell you this was live. Sorry, John. I'm kidding. All right, so we're going to get that book out there sometime soon.
Yeah.
And we'll keep everybody updated. Any final words, John? You did a great job describing it. Got a question for Cato? I'm sure you watched the trial back in the day.
It doesn't even have to be a trial.
I've gotten this question many, many times, but, were you surprised at, how the prosecutors, seemed to bungle the case? And do you believe that, that OJ was guilty?
Well, you know what? I'm a lot like you, because the first time in my entire life, that was the first time I'd seen a court. I've never even had parking tickets. I lived a very clean life. I came from Wisconsin, very large, loving family. So it was very, very different to me. And I didn't know any lawyerese. I didn't understand a lot of the things being called a hostile witness. I didn't know what that meant. But I do believe that through the course of time of me having a lawyer and to be educated by them and telling me things that are going wrong, like never ask a question you don't know the answer to when you put on the glove. He just said they definitely bungle things. And Vincent Bugliosi, who wrote Helter Skelter, I'm sure you know who Bugliosi is, famous attorney, who I met at a party, and he gave me his book. He signed as a book that he wrote about the trial. He said, "You were probably one of the most important witnesses for Marcia Clark, and she made you look a fool, and you were her witness, and she didn't treat you right." So it made me feel at peace, because certain times that a lot of negativity came towards me, and I was like, God, I just was being honest in everything I did, and I was a deer in the headlights because I wanted to make sure I answered the questions correctly. Like I said, my first time ever being in a witness in a trial that was televised, so I wanted to make sure that everything I said was correct, and it made me look like I was pausing, and people made their opinion he's lying, and it was everything was the opposite. I was being 100% truthful. But my opinion is, yeah, I think he's a guilty man. He's got to face his maker. He's died now, so I don't know if he made his last penance or not. But my opinion is he's a guilty man.
Yeah. So John, thanks.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Appreciate you doing it, John. Thank you. It's going to be great. I'm so excited for our viewers, our listeners, and a lot of people that are going to see this to really know what actually happened and victory at the end of the road. So, all right.
Thank you.
All right, John.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Have a great day. Say hi to the Kennedys.
Yeah.
Enjoy your day. Take care.
All right. Well, it's such a complex story, Cato. I spent 2 years of my life writing this book too, with John. A lot of work. It's a lot of details. I almost felt I got a law degree from writing the book. You know what I mean? You learn so much.
Right. It's great that he gets his story out there because good people, he's good people. And it's just amazing that the corruption and money, what it can do to you whatever prosecutors are trying to get to another ring on the ladder, go higher and higher up, no matter what. They don't care the feelings that this guy's got a family. Yeah. It blows me away. What a great story.
Yep.
And your book has got to come out. It's going to be an amazing read.
It is. A lot of details.
It's got to be an amazing read.
Yep. Okay, so thank you everybody for watching this. Load us up with comments. I'm sure you got a lot of opinions now that you know the real story. Make sure you follow Cato on social media. Follow me. All their links are here. Get into our archive. Check out our old shows. Our audio podcast. Go there too. Spreaker's doing a hell of a job on the audio side for us. Go to Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. And by the way, we're starting a new channel pretty soon. So I'm going to tell you about it. It's going to be a way to see more of our content in different ways. So probably an announcement on that next week.
Thank you so much.
For the one and only Cato Kalin, who's heading out of town tomorrow. Oh, yeah. He's heading out. He's going.
I'm fine. It's someone else that's worried about it. Like you can't believe.
In a couple of minutes, I'm going to give him all the details, okay? All right. Hey, thanks for watching, everybody. Do your thing. We'll see you next week right here on Tom Zenner Scandal. One degree of scandalous. It's a tough episode to beat. That was fascinating. If you liked that one today on the real story behind the Varsity Blues scandal, check out the story of Bryan Kohberger and the Idaho killings. And right over here, it's how O.J. Simpson got busted in Vegas.